A lot of people have heard of the Elder Scrolls Arena, but not many have played it, especially for more than a few minutes. I see a lot of idle curiosity about it, being the humble first game in what is now a massive series, and the only game before ESO to allow you to visit every province, but a lot of people simply don't have the will to go back and play these clunky old school RPGs. Released in 1994, this was Bethesda's first foray into the RPG genre that's their bread and butter today, but a lot has changed since then. As the lore and quests have grown more complex, the dungeons and mechanics have grown more simple. Before I really got into it, I always wondered how deep the scope in this game is. Are our favorite factions like the Dark Brotherhood in it? Do the provinces feel different from one another? Can I make choices that define my character's thoughts and morality? After finishing the game, I can confidently say that the answer to all of these questions is, kinda? To see exactly what I mean, we'll have to take a deep dive into this dungeon crawling adventure together. And make no mistake, this is a dungeon crawler through and through. You could actually argue that it has the best dungeons in the series, and many who've played it would be inclined to agree with you. This game does have a lot of charm and ideas in it, but many of these ideas wouldn't be fully realized until the release of Daggerfall 2 years later. Despite the title, this is actually not my first experience with the Elder Scrolls Arena. I played it once before, about 12 or 13 years ago. At that time, Arena and Daggerfall were already free on Bethesda's website, but they didn't have the nice Steam releases with the bundled and pre-configured DOSBox setup to run them. Not only that, but my only computer at the time was a very slow and janky Mac. So I had to figure out how to set up Wine to run DOSBox to play Arena, which I could probably do pretty quickly nowadays, but as a 13 or 14-year-old without nearly as much technical know-how, this took me hours over multiple days. I finally got the game running, went through the first dungeon, spawned in a town, and saved. I then killed a random NPC just to see what would happen, and promptly got killed by a guard. I turned it off, determined to play more sometime, and never did. I'm much more used to old games now. While I'm not the most well-versed, I can at least say I've played Fallout 1 and 2 multiple times. What makes Arena a bit more difficult than Fallout is the combination of outdated controls along with requiring real-time reactions and traversal instead of being turn-based and top-down. So I'm happy to say that 12 years later, on my second attempt, I've completed the Elder Scrolls Arena. The game is easier to play with several essential mods I'll go over, but there's currently no large-scale overhaul into a modern game engine like Daggerfall Unity. There is an in-progress one called OpenTES Arena, but I was in the mood to try this game again and didn't want to wait, especially since it's so short, at least for an RPG. OpenTES Arena actually got a new release just a couple weeks before I started playing, but as of writing it still only includes the first dungeon of the game being playable. Daggerfall is of course much more popular, and obviously this is largely due to the release of Daggerfall Unity, but I think it's also a bit of a chicken and the egg scenario. Daggerfall Unity had a dedicated group of fans willing to make it happen because it's the more popular game, despite Arena being a theoretically easier project. Looking at the Daggerfall Unity GitHub repo, it has 77 contributors. So why is this? I think it comes down to two main things about Arena. First, the simplicity of the gameplay doesn't allow much character expression or player choice. A hallmark of the Elder Scrolls series is that your character has skills which increase in level when using them, but that wasn't introduced until Daggerfall. Arena only has character attributes like strength, intelligence, etc. It's funny that Skyrim came full circle by only having skills and no character attributes. Furthermore, there are no guilds to join in Arena, and really no interesting side content. The only thing there is to do outside of the main quest are Radiant quests. I know the term Radiant quest didn't exist back then, but I'll be using it regardless. The Mages Guild is the only faction with a real presence in the game, while other factions like the Thieves Guild and the Dark Brotherhood are mentioned, but only in flavor text for Radiant quests. Second reason is the simplicity of the story in the setting. It's a pretty basic go get the 8 MacGuffins to make the big MacGuffin to use to fight the big bad type of story. And the Elder Scrolls lore we know and love wasn't really introduced until Daggerfall, and then expanded on in Morrowind and the Pocket Guide to the Empire. The only lore in this game really is, first, the vague geographic shape of Tamriel and its provinces, though this was refined over the years, see how Vardenfell changed. Second, the names of provinces and their settlements, though the Imperial province was retconned to Cyrodiil, and also got more settlements than just the Imperial city. Third, what races are native to each province, though even this was somewhat retconned and expanded on. Khajiit are not cat people in Arena, but only related to cat people. I thought this was entirely removed from the lore, but turns out the non-cat Khajiit still exist. They're just a specific breed of Khajiit born under a specific phase of the moon. Imperials were also later added into the lore, and orcs are recognized as a civilized race and not just monsters in Daggerfall, although they're still not playable until Morrowind. Fourth is the existence of certain factions. The Blades, Mages Guild, Thieves Guild, and Dark Brotherhood, though details about these groups weren't really expanded on until Daggerfall. Once again, only the Mages Guild is actually physically represented in the game. There's also some group called the Warfrats, who are apparently an organization similar to the Thieves Guild, but they never appeared in a future game. Also, factions do have defined relationships with each other, which has a minor background effect on Palace Radiant quests, which we'll see later. Lastly, just some other random tidbits. There are artifacts in Arena which were later retconned into Daedric artifacts once the Daedra were invented. The dwarves are mentioned to exist, despite them not appearing in the game itself. Mana Marco and the Underking are also mentioned, both of whom would play more active roles in Daggerfall. If you don't know, the Underking is the freaky guy on the cover of Daggerfall. Now we know it's not in the game, so what is in the game? Well, there are all 9 provinces of Tamriel, each filled with larger city-states, smaller towns, and even smaller villages. The names of these settlements were chosen by hand, but pretty much everything within them was procedurally generated. The procedural generation uses the same seed for every instance of the game, so every settlement will be the exact same from one save to the next. In these settlements you can buy and sell weapons, buy spells, rest at inns, and get radiant quests from inns and palaces. And then, Arena has dungeons, which are pretty much the heart and soul of this game. They're randomly generated dungeons, which are generated when you get a quest to go to them, and as far as I know, these are actually dynamically generated on the fly since different quest types have different dungeon layouts. But then there are the hand-designed story dungeons, which really are the main attraction here. Finally, there's the wilderness, wide open areas outside the city walls. It's kind of a neat place, but there's not really much to do out here. So, to summarize, what there is to do in this game is the main story, where you go from town to town learning about locations of main story dungeons and then doing those dungeons. Radiant quests, which are usually just to either go to a specific building or do a randomly generated dungeon, or wander off into the wilderness. Not a lot on paper, but given the time period and that this was Bethesda's first game of this type, I think the scope is perfectly fine. It's at least enough to entertain you for the 25 hours or so it takes to complete this game. Jeweler has a great video, linked in the description, that talks a lot about the history of how this game came to be made, as well as the nitty-gritty of a lot of aspects. But I want this video to be more about just the experience of playing the game, and more specifically, my experience. Special thanks to both Jeweler and Patrician TV for inspiring this video with their own long-form video essays on Elder Scrolls games. Particularly Patrician TV, as he talks a lot in his videos about his process of script writing, recording, and editing, and it made me feel like it was something I could do. Huge thanks to Marsh SMT, who got me into SMT, and therefore more into old school RPGs, and inspired the overall format and tone of this video, as well as actually giving me advice on making this video. I didn't have the idea to make this and thus start recording until after the Fortress of Ice. Also, I learned that for some reason OBS did not like to grab the Arena window if Arena was opened after OBS was, including if I had to restart it for whatever reason. FYI, if this happens to you, change the window match priority setting to say same executable instead of same type. So, some of this footage is going to be supplemented by video I found on YouTube. Huge shoutouts to No Commentary God Dog for allowing me to use their footage. If you see the character named Jiju, then you'll know it's from their videos. Link to their channel in the description. I did go back and record my own footage of the opening dungeon and character creation though. In time-honored Bethesda tradition, you'll need to install some mods to make your game a bit more playable. Luckily, these are all pretty easy to install, basically just drag files into the right folders in your Arena or DOSBox install. First is TES Arena Remapped 3.0. If you only get one mod, get this one. It makes the controls much more palatable to a modern gamer, and makes the game feel a lot more smooth to play overall. I will note that this mod doesn't access some secret function of Arena to remap keys, but literally remaps them on the DOSBox level. So it's not that Arena now knows that space means jump, it's that DOSBox is interpreting the space key as the J key, which Arena knows is the jump key. What this means is that if you have to type, which you do decently often in this game, you'll end up typing absolute nonsense. You have to hold control while typing to use normal keys, which is easy to forget and feels very awkward to do. Still, this slight annoyance is more than worth it to be able to walk around using WASD. You do have to use Q and E to turn the camera, kind of like tank controls, meaning movement is still kind of clunky, but it's much better than my memory playing the game on a Mac 12 years ago. Next is TES Arena refonted. Not much to say here, just makes the font a bit easier to read. Next is Sound Patch and Speech No Hiss. These just fix some jank in the game's original sound effects. Finally is TES Arena Intro Fix. This one isn't really necessary, but there are some errors in the game's intro text. You'll skip the intro after the first time anyway, but if you want to make sure the game leaves a good first impression, it's good to have. There are also some mods that have a lot of downloads, but I'm not sure I recommend. First is Intuitive UI v2. Basically, it makes the UI kinda boring and black, and in my opinion just makes it uglier without really making it more intuitive. Next is the Eye of Nocturnal. I was going to use this, but I didn't end up because I didn't want to re-roll my character, and it actually requires you to make a new character once the mod is installed. It increases the game's render distance, which is pretty nice, but that only really applies in the wilderness. In dungeons, there's hardly ever that much empty space in front of you, and in cities, you'll mostly see walls and buildings before the render distance runs out, even if the weather is clear. It's definitely not a detriment to have this, but I just used the game's default max render distance and I thought it was perfectly fine. Finally is FPS and Stability Fix. This one sounds nice, but has one major issue, which is noted on its Nexus Issues page, which is that it mutes all sounds in the game. Dropping to DOS fixes the sound, but I think that also just disables the mod, because when I do this I get lag spikes when exiting buildings and cities, and more crashes in general. So if you're okay with playing the game muted in exchange for stability, then it is worth it, but until that issue is fixed I can't wholly recommend this mod. Also, dropping to DOS is really annoying, because you can't drop to DOS until you've loaded a save, and you have to click through like 10 slow-ass screens before you can load a save. There are also some more ambitious mods out there. There's a mod that restores an unused floor of a dungeon, one that adds the Imperial race, a texture overhaul, one that replaces Daggerfall with a new city, and even one that ports levels from one of Bethesda's Terminator games into Arena for some reason. Of course, there's also nude sprite mods. Also, Garfield. The game opens with a text intro, which, as previously mentioned, has some errors in it. It introduces that the Emperor is an imposter, replaced by a bad dude named Jagar Tharn, who used to work for him as a battle mage, and also killed his own apprentice, Rhea Silmain. Trying to justify the name Arena, which was too late in their marketing cycle to change when they decided it would no longer be an arena-based game, they say that the world has become so dangerous people call it the Arena, because it's like an arena. Since I made a new character for the purpose of showing character creation in the first dungeon, this is my Nord Barbarian, Dick Ripley. Not exactly a traditional Nord name, but maybe it's a title here and somehow. Like every Elder Scrolls game up to and including Oblivion, both your race and gender determine your starting attributes, though Oblivion Remastered changed the gender selection to instead be choosing a region of the province you're from, which I think is way cooler. Although the descriptions of these choices seem to have been poorly translated. Race also has some other benefits, some of which are surprisingly similar to racial benefits still seen in the games today. Orgonians are good swimmers, Bredens are resistant to magic, High Elves are immune to paralysis, Khajiit are better thieves, and Nords are resistant to cold. Redguards get a bonus to melee weapons, while Wood Elves get a bonus to ranged weapons like bows, and Dark Elves get a bonus to both, although a slightly smaller one. Despite not planning on using bows, I went with Dark Elves since they at least get a small melee damage bonus, and their attribute spread seemed good for the spellsword I wanted to create. I also see Bredens highly recommended to new players for their magic resistance, which makes sense because magic enemies in this game can down you pretty quickly if you're not resisting them some way or another. Like many things, Daggerfall started the trend of being able to create your own class, so in Arena you're stuck with the 18 included ones. Not only that, but Arena really locks you into your class by limiting what equipment you can use, although Daggerfall does the same thing. Only 3 classes can wear plate armor and use tower shields, and 2 classes straight up can't use armor at all. Some classes also can't use certain weapons. Like D&D, class also affects your hit die when you level up, more on that later though. Class also determines at a base level how good you are at stealing, as well as crit chance and how many spell points you get. For most classes, the answer to that last one is 0. Only 7 classes in the game are capable of casting spells at all, outside of using enchanted items which cast spells for you. Notably, there's no class that can both cast spells and wear plate armor. Finally, and most importantly, your class determines your level curve, of which there are 5 lettered from A to E. Curves A and B only have 1 entry each, while C has 6, and D and E each have 5. As mentioned before, I went with the Spell Sword because I wanted to experience the game's magic and melee combat systems. I later learned that once my stats got high enough, I could lockpick and steal pretty effectively too, so I feel like I really missed out on nothing playing a Spell Sword. Battle Mage is pretty similar and gets a bit more spell points, but is limited to somewhat worse armor and shields and has slightly worse hit die. Both classes also belong in the highest level curve, which I guess is fair when they have very few restrictions. Let's go over each of the character attributes. Strength is mainly for melee damage, but also determines max fatigue, jump distance, and carry weight. I'll be completely honest, I didn't know what fatigue did in this game until looking it up after completing it. It goes down very slowly and goes back up when you rest. The lowest I ever saw my bar get to was like half in a late game dungeon where I subsisted on potions the whole time instead of resting. According to the UESP Twitter, if it runs out, you either just pass out and then wake up again later, or die if there's monsters nearby or you're swimming. Intelligence mainly helps with max spell points, which only increase when you increase intelligence and not per level. It also helps in negotiation and lockpicking. When you click on a door or chest you want to lockpick, it gives you a little message to let you know how hard it'll be for you to pick it, which is pretty nice. Willpower provides resistance to spells as well as also affecting negotiation. This is an important one for any class, as spells hurt in this game. Agility is probably the most important stat, except maybe for pure spellcasters. It affects hit chance, physical resistance, dodge chance, as well as lockpicking and stealing chance. Someone on Reddit told me to increase it in increments of 5, not exactly sure why though. Speed affects movement speed and fire rate of bows. It's only really worth investing in as an archer. My base movement speed felt more than adequate, so I never put points into it. Endurance affects your max health, but indirectly. The higher your endurance, you get a bigger bonus to hit points when you level up, added to your health die roll, which is determined by your class. These mechanics are pulled straight from D&D, although I never roll for health in D&D, because the chance of screwing my build is too high. Anyway, unlike D&D, endurance is not retroactive, and even if you put points into it when you level up, those points won't apply into your next level, so you really want to invest in it early. An endurance of 94 gives you the maximum HP bonus of +5 per level. Endurance also increases your max fatigue. Personality seems like a dump stat. The only thing it helps with is negotiation, which intelligence and willpower also increase. Doesn't seem worth it, especially when it doesn't take long to be flush with cash in this game. But maybe if I could equip plate armor, I'd be more strapped for cash as I try to buy all the best pieces out there. According to the UESP, luck affects chance to hit or parry, though I'm not sure what parrying is. Okay, so apparently if you and an opponent swing at the same time, you can parry each other. So I guess luck tilts it so you can possibly hit them through the parry? It also gives bonus chance to shopkeepers accepting offers, picking locks, stealing, and golden loot piles. Aside from the first thing, this stat mainly seems to help with getting cash, which again was never really an issue for me. Your initial attributes are rolled randomly, again echoing D&D conventions, so keep re-rolling until you get a good spread. You want at least 15 bonus points available to you, and high stats that are important to your class. Not only is your health increase random based on your class's hit die, but so is the amount of new attribute points per level. This means it can be prudent to watch your XP and pay attention to the needed amount for your next level up, making sure to save right before an encounter that will level you to make sure you don't get a bad level. While the number of attribute points you get is obvious, health increases less so unless you pay attention, so reload a save from before you leveled to check. You'll get between 3 to 6 bonus attribute points on level up, so I'd try to make sure you get at least 5 if possible, though sometimes those levels can really sneak up on you at a bad time. Something that's important to note, the only thing that gives you XP in this game is defeating enemies. After making your character, an FMV Rhea Silmain will appear and talk at you for quite a long time. Basically, she just says that you're her only hope, and you need to get out of the sewers, and she'll come back later with more instructions. With that, the first dungeon starts. Make sure to press F3 to turn off the annoyingly slow pixelation effect of every text box. I'll discuss more about this introductory dungeon later, but make sure to save immediately or you'll have to remake your character if you die. While we're talking about saving, one minor annoyance about saves is that they don't have timestamps. When I play Fallout 1 and 2, which similarly have these 10 saves that you have to name every time you save, I just save over the oldest slot each time so I have a continuous flow of save games. Since the lack of a timestamp means sussing out my oldest slot would be a difficult memory game, I just always start at slot 1 when entering a dungeon and occasionally go to the next one, usually after doing a full rest or getting to a new floor. I also recommend always saving to your first slot at the end of a play session so you don't have to go trying to figure out what your most recent save was when you want to keep playing. The overall gameplay loop of Arena is quite simple. Get a quest, do a dungeon, loot, go back to town to sell that loot, buy upgrades and items, get another quest. This basically applies whether you're doing story or radiant dungeons, although taverns always give you quests which just require you to find another building in the same town, and sometimes palace quests will also just send you to a building in another settlement. Aside from the name of a settlement, towns are entirely procedurally generated. Like all procedural generation, some things are of course hand-designed, like the layouts of interiors and the shape of buildings, but which interior layout or building shape is used for a particular place is random. Towns are decently big, obviously nowhere near as big as real cities, but the biggest settlements feel like they could genuinely be the size of a smallish town in a time before cars existed, having hundreds of buildings. The names of various establishments in the town are also randomized, and sometimes are fit to match the location. For example, port cities all have highly nautical inn names like the Dirty Gull and the Howling Ship. Building and object textures also vary from town to town and province to province. For example, desert towns have cacti and palm trees. Navigating these large, randomly generated towns can be difficult. Luckily, the townsfolk are pretty helpful. During the day, there are wandering NPCs who will stop for you when you get near them, unless you have your weapon out, in which case they'll run away. The skin color of these NPCs will change depending on province, and clothing can change based on location, with colder climates wearing heavier clothes and desert towns wearing lighter clothes, but they're pretty generic all around. You can ask them who they are, and they'll tell you their name and occupation. There are also static, more interesting looking NPCs like jugglers, ne'er-do-wells, and prostitutes who have different dialogue when you ask who they are. Note that all static NPCs, both inside and outside, do not have different sprites per region, and will generally all appear as vaguely white humans, giving the impression that every town in Morrowind is ruled by Nords. You can ask the NPCs about rumors. General will either give you nothing, or some interesting dialogue about the goings-ons of the settlement or the Empire as a whole. This is also how you get artifact quests, more on that later. You can also ask about work, and if you're lucky, you'll get notified the palace ruler or local tavern keeper has a job available. More importantly, you can ask these NPCs for directions. There's only one palace and mages guild per city, so you can only ask for one of those. Palaces are also pretty easy to find since they're a notable shape around the edge of the city walls. You can also ask them about stores, taverns, and temples, either a specific one or the nearest one. Asking for a specific one can be helpful when you're trying to fulfill a quest or looking for a specific item. Here's some important information. Since all towns were generated from the same seed, you can actually look up where different special items can be found in stores. More on this when I talk about equipment. Taverns are wretched hives of scum and villainy. Everyone in them is a complete asshole to you, ranging from passive-aggressive, to threatening, to violently racist towards whatever race you are. This is especially funny because you start out in a random town in your home province, so imagine my surprise when I started the game and walked into a tavern in Morrowind, only to find every patron in there was calling for the extermination of the Dark Elf race. Anyway, the only person who's not an asshole is the tavern keeper. If he has a job, you'll be offered it when you talk to him, and you can agree or disagree. There are 3 types of tavern jobs, but they all boil down to go outside and ask someone for directions to a specific building, go to that building, and then maybe return to the tavern. Delivery quests have you bring an item somewhere. Escort quests have you bring a person somewhere, and it shows their face in the top left. By the way, these are the same faces you can choose for your character. And retrieval quests have you go somewhere to get something and then bring it back to the tavern. You'll be paid a paltry sum of gold for your efforts. This is maybe worth it in the very early game, but the amount of gold quickly becomes worthless, especially since it's not like you'll get any XP for the quest. Aside from the quests, you can buy a room, or even try sneaking into one if you're confident in your thievery skills. There are multiple room types, and pretty much the only dialogue tavern patrons will give you that isn't related to how much they wish you didn't exist is to advise you to not get the single. Apparently better rooms have better healing rates, but I literally never had an issue of resting and not healing fully for however long I wanted to rest for. I guess if you were on a timed Radiant quest and really needed to heal and had a tight deadline, but that would only be relevant for Palace quests, and since most of those give you a month or more to complete them, almost all of which is lost to travel time, a few extra hours in the end isn't going to kill you. Oh, and you can haggle for your room price, but it's not really worth it unless you're planning to sleep a long time to wait for a holiday or something. Notably, taverns are the only establishment open at night. You can't sleep in the city unless you rent a room in a tavern, so if you arrive at a city and it's night, you'll probably need to sleep until morning to accomplish what you actually came to the city to do. You could also go into the wilderness and sleep out there, but that's usually more effort than just finding a tavern because you'll get attacked every hour or two. When you sleep in the tavern, you'll wake up in one of the rooms available in its layout. Stores are where you can buy and sell gear. Buying and selling is done with a more traditional haggling where they say a price, you say a price, and eventually you meet in the middle. You can also employ a classic technique by saying a higher price than you really want and hope they'll agree to the price that you actually are going for, though if your price is too ridiculous they won't even entertain it. Eventually, if you agree to their price or they agree to yours, you can complete the transaction. You can also have gear repaired here, which unfortunately takes 10 days regardless of the condition of the item. Having a shield seems to keep those protected armor pieces' conditions from going down, as I never had to repair them. Mages guilds are very important, both as quest destinations and for their services. Here you can buy magic items, including non-magical accessories, spells, and potions, all of which are very important. Though obviously spells are not important if you're one of the 11 classes who can't cast them. You can also make your own spells, a time-honored Elder Scrolls tradition until Skyrim. This is pretty cool, allowing you to choose different effects, their base values, their value increase per level, and durations. Some effects have some other properties that I'm not sure what they do. Fortify skill spells have this property called release rate, and I could not for the life of me find out what it actually does. I think it's either the rate at which the spell is released into you, or maybe the rate at which the spell releases out of you once the initial duration ends. Finally, you can identify magic items. If you want, you can save scum and try to just remember what your magic items do, but that gets hard once you get a lot of them, and by that point money isn't much of an issue anyway. You can also barter at mages guilds, except to identify items, and I found them to be generally pushovers in terms of negotiating prices, much more so than the store owners. Temples are probably the least useful places, but you'll visit them sometimes. You can get a blessing, which the game doesn't explain, but apparently this boosts your hit rate. Problem is, it also boosts enemy hit rates. Needless to say, I never use this. You can also cure diseases, which is very good, although you usually want to use a potion or spell of cure disease as soon as you catch one if you can help it. You can also heal at them, but I never use this since I'd rather just sleep at the tavern for a bit, and temples aren't even open at night. Palaces are pretty much just a place to get quests from the settlement's ruler. You can also break into their side rooms and get attacked by guards, but as far as I saw there's no treasure to pilfer by doing this, so I'm not sure why you would. Palace quests can be a bit tricky to get. Every day at 6 AM the palace will generate if it will have a quest or not, based on 5% times your player level, meaning for lower level characters the odds of getting a palace quest can be quite bad. You can save scum it I guess, but it's annoying since you can't save in palaces or taverns. Anyway, the quest will then be available until 6 PM. These palace quests are where all of the game's real side content is generated from outside artifact quests, as they not only mention familiar factions like the Dark Brotherhood, but they're also what actually generates random dungeon layouts for you to go explore. The same type of quests you get at inns can also be given to you as palace quests, only instead of going to another building in the same town, you have to go to another town, and if you rest during these, you can get attacked, ostensibly by a faction that's opposed to the ruler who gave you the quests, although they're really just generic enemies. Then, there are 3 more quest types, each of which will generate a dungeon with 1 or 2 floors. Capture quests require you to defeat a human boss, at which point they'll join you as a face. Rescue quests need you to actually find a person past the boss to click on, adding them as a face, and escort back to the palace. Finally, you may be asked to simply slay a powerful monster. There is some jank with palace quest generation. I once got a palace quest that I couldn't actually complete as he sent me to a settlement 20 days away with a time limit of 10 days. I also got a quest where the ruler said I was to travel to a palace 2012 days away. The directions they give you when sending you somewhere are also complete nonsense. They will literally tell you to go somewhere to the east when it's actually to the west. Quest log is not very good. It's just an ever-growing document where quests keep getting appended to the end of it, and you have to click more to see the next part of the log. It's basically a straight DOS text file with a slightly fancier UI. It doesn't tell you how many pages are left, and if you click too fast then you'll close the log and have to go through it all again. Arena also has holidays, something which would not come back after Daggerfall. These are pretty nice. Mostly, depending on what the holiday is, it means one or more services around the town will be either free or discounted. They each have their own flavor text describing their vibe, which I really like. As a random aside, NPCs in the Imperial City are Red Guards. According to the UESP, this is because the Imperial Province does not have an index for NPC skin color, so it defaults to the first entry, which is Red Guards. It'd be cool if the NPCs were actually random races to show that the Imperial City is a melting pot, but I guess that's too much thought to expect out of a game where the Imperial Province only has a single settlement. There's also the Wilderness, where you can find villages and farms of varying sizes. Sometimes you'll even find a walled village that's quite big. There's also randomly generated miniature dungeons to explore. There isn't really much reason to go out here except that's kinda cool. I suppose it could be useful for a lower level character to whom palace quests are not yet viable to go looking for XP and gold, but the dungeons out here are so few and far between it's probably more efficient to just go back to the latest story dungeon and grind that instead. You'll find taverns and temples out here, and the wandering NPCs will even direct you to the nearest one, although trying to ask for a specific one, or anything else really, will have them tell you to go back into the city. They'll even tell you where the nearest dungeon is, which is pretty nice. Early on in the game, I found a wilderness dungeon that seemed like an abandoned fighters guild building of some kind that now had rogues living in it, but unfortunately I have no footage of this. To note, the world in the wilderness loops when you go far enough in one direction, so every settlement is really its own pocket dimension that doesn't connect to any other. Alright, before we move on to dungeons, let's talk about crime. Crime in Arena is pretty simple. If you're caught committing a crime, then the NPCs around you will despawn, and some enemy knights or warriors will spawn in and try to kill you. The only thing differentiating these from generic human enemies is that they say halt, or stop, thief. There's no such thing as a bounty, so if you kill your assailants, or just leave to a different loading zone, your crimes are gone from the game's memory. Palace rulers don't even care if you kill their guards right in front of them. What crimes are there? First, breaking and entering, i.e. trying to lockpick buildings and towns. If you fail, there's a chance it will spawn guards, even if no one sees you do it. This can get you into stores at night, but their proprietors won't be there, though there may be some loot you can steal. You can also break into random homes, which is neat to check out their layouts. Maybe kill the inhabitants and loot some stuff. Check out this house I broke into that has 3 floors despite barely being taller than the door from the outside. Next is simple murder. Static NPCs cannot be harmed, but you can kill wandering NPCs, and guards will spawn immediately. Finally, the big crime, theft. You can attempt to steal from any shopkeeper. There are 3 outcomes: success and you steal a random item, failure but you are not caught, or failure and you are caught, at which point the NPC will disappear and guards will spawn. You can also attempt to pickpocket wandering NPCs, which can similarly get you caught, but as far as I can tell you never get anything from it aside from some funny flavor text. I recorded this footage to show myself failing at theft, planning to actually make a thief to show what success looks like, but apparently at some point my character got good at theft because I actually succeeded multiple times before getting caught. Also, you'll notice me saving there. You can't usually save in places you can steal from, a deterrent to save scumming, but for some reason the Mages Guild is an exception. Now that we've talked about the overworld, let's talk about the underworld. Dungeons aren't too complicated on paper, mainly being multi-floor affairs with a bunch of hallways and rooms of various sizes. There are pits and water in dungeons, adding interesting navigation options to them. Although getting out of these can be janky if you're not looking at the exact right angle, especially since when you're in a pit you can't really see where the floor is above your head. Here's footage of me struggling to get out of a pit. Also, monsters can attack you when you're in a pit or water, but you can't really attack them until you climb out of it. And they can body block you from climbing out, which can create some real bullshit situations. If you can, use levitation magic to avoid these frustrations. As you explore a dungeon, you'll run into various monsters. I found story dungeons to be very dense with encounters, sometimes feeling like there's a new group of enemies around every corner. Meanwhile, the randomly generated dungeons are much lighter, only having a few enemies per floor, which actually makes them feel like a welcome catharsis since you can freely run around a while. While monsters do not scale to your level, i.e. an orc is always only going to be as strong as an orc is, randomly generated dungeons do spawn stronger types of monsters based on your level. Story dungeons, on the other hand, have preset monster spawns. While the only thing that changes about a monster stats are their random health rolls, humans on the other hand scale to your current level. I can't find any information on how these human stats are actually decided, or even what classes they can be. I've personally seen knights, warriors, spell swords, mages, rogues, nightblades, barbarians, and monks. Most of them go down pretty quickly aside from the knights, who can be quite hard to take down, either with magic or physical attacks. You will have to constantly rest in dungeons, sometimes after every encounter in the early game unless you have a good supply of healing magic. Unfortunately, this process is really cumbersome. The dungeon will constantly spawn in enemies to interrupt your rest, sometimes immediately every time you rest several times in a row. Some dungeons have raised areas which apparently reduce, but still don't eliminate the attack rate, and when enemies nearby are preventing your rest, it can sometimes be very difficult to actually find them if they're in separated passageways. It's also confusing early on because there are two separate messages that will display when trying to rest that say enemies are nearby, but they mean different things. If it says you can't camp, enemies are nearby, with 3 exclamation points, then there are existing enemies you have to kill before you can rest. If it just says enemies are nearby, ... then it has just spawned enemies near you to interrupt your rest. These can be hard to tell apart if you don't know the difference, since it'll often spawn these enemies in instantly. In particularly difficult dungeons in the early game, I was very put off by having to rest so often when resting was such a painful endeavor every time. I didn't want to use my magic for cool things like attacks or buffs because I wanted to save it for healing so I wouldn't have to rest so often. A strategy I realized later in the game that can work pretty well is to find stairs in a dungeon and try resting near them. If enemies appear, simply run away to the other floor and try again. This doesn't work if both ends of the stairs have set enemy spawns near them though, which does happen sometimes. Combat has multiple swing types you can use, something that I understand survived up until Morrowind. Luckily, the control guide for Remapped has a handy guide. Horizontal swings are standard attacks. Thrusting is a bit more likely to hit but does less damage. Diagonal swings are a bit harder to hit but do a bit more damage. Finally, vertical slashes from up to down are least likely to hit but do the most damage. I typically spammed horizontal and diagonal swings, but if I was feeling particularly confident, I'd throw out some vertical swings. I only really did thrusting in the early game when my agility wasn't quite as good. Spellcasting is performed by pressing the spell button and selecting the spell you want from a list. There's also a quick cast button, but for some reason this didn't work for me. I think it's supposed to recast your last spell. Anyway, time is thankfully frozen while you select your spell, but if it's a targeted spell, then time will resume as you frantically try to aim your attack. Spells can damage enemies with touch, target, or an AoE, either around you or around a point you click. They can obviously do things like healing, curing disease, and fortifying attributes. They can also shield you, which basically gives you temp HP, resist certain elements, reflect spells, or even delete and create floors and walls in the dungeon. That's right, there's a spell called Passfall that can straight up delete walls in dungeons, with some exceptions, so you can plow right through mazes. I recommend making a version of Passwall that only does a single wall though, as the default spell does 3, which is quite expensive for Magicka, and you only really need 1 a lot of the time. Dungeons have loot piles and various other things on the ground to interact with. You have a weight limit based on strength, but also a hard item count limit, so you'll quickly find yourself wanting to drop non-magical items since they're not worth very much. Smaller things to interact with, like parchments or keys on the ground, can be really annoying since you can't click on them if they're too close to the bottom of the screen, or if they're too far away from you, so you have to back up to the perfect distance from them to be able to click on them. As for enemy loot, human enemies will have a full set of gear on them. Human-ish enemies like orcs and minotaurs might have a single piece of gear on them, occasionally two. Monstrous enemies like ghouls and golems have a chance to have gold on them, as do the aforementioned types. As far as I can tell, enemies that are just wild animals like wolves and rats will never have any loot on them at all. Randomly generated dungeons have a pre-specified size per floor that, as far as I can tell, is consistent across all of them. You can also really feel the random generation in the layout. Also, it's very easy to run right past the stairs in these dungeons, missing them until you check your map. Story dungeons can be quite large and often have noticeable structure to them as if they're a more real lived-in place. They'll also have doors locked by riddles in them, and I don't consider myself a great riddler or anything, but I didn't think most of them were too hard. I won't lie and say I didn't look some up though. Some doors and chests in dungeons will be locked. You can enter steal mode to try to pick their locks, open them with an open spell, or just bash them open with your weapon. True equality for all classes. Also, funnily enough, this game basically has the requires key locks that would later be introduced in Oblivion, though it calls them magically held locks. Sometimes in dungeons with moving over different elevations, you sort of get stuck in the ground and have to jump out, which is mildly annoying. Also, when you walk past open doors a lot of the time, the door sprite will swap to the opposite wall for some reason. If you want to take on dungeons, you'll need some good equipment, so let's talk about that. Armor comes in several slots. boots, greaves, cuirass, gauntlets, left and right pauldron, and helmet. I find it mildly weird that pauldrons are the only thing to be split into left and right, but whatever. Shields add extra AC to the greaves, cuirass, gauntlets, and left pauldron areas. Arena works off an old-school D&D system called THAC 0, which means lower numbers are actually better, so you want your armor to be showing as negative number as possible. For leather and chain armor, what you get is what you get. You don't get better versions of them, or even enchanted versions. Leather gives -3 AC, and chain gives -6. Plate armor gives -9 at a base, but like future Elder Scrolls games, can be made of increasingly better metals, including series staples like Elven, Dwarven, and Ebony, which give better AC bonuses. Notably, any armor which says a metal type, EX Steel Helm, is plate armor. As implied by the earlier statement, plate armor can be enchanted, granting you either an attribute bonus, a usable magic power, or spell reflection. Spell reflection gear, in particular, is quite expensive. Shields come in 4 varieties, giving you from -1 to -4 AC as a base, but luckily all shield types can be made of better metals and enchanted. Weapons of all varieties, even staffs, can also be made of better materials to give them bonus hit chance and damage, as well as enchanted. Material type is also important for weapons, since some enemies can only be hit by certain weapon types. At Mithril or above, you don't have to worry and you can just hit everything. Vampires, interestingly, can be hit by silver, but not Elven or Dwarven, which come after silver in the tiers. Next, there are magic items, which can be equipped and then used to cast base game spells. Bracers, crystals, marks, and rings all have no purpose other than this, but having a variety is good since you can only have one of each type equipped at a time. Finally, accessories act like extra armor slots, which is extremely helpful to the 15 classes who can't equip plate armor. There are amulets, belts, bracelets, and torques. Like magic items, only one of each type can be equipped at once. These items can either give a flat bonus to AC across your whole body based on their metal, up to -5 with Ebony, or another helpful enchantment to fortify an attribute. I kept a mix of attribute boosting and AC granting accessories on, trying to make up for my lost AC from not having plate armor while also keeping my attributes high. Two-handed weapons obviously do more damage than one-handed weapons, but you're losing out on the bonus AC and enchantment of a shield. If it was just the AC, I would say it's a toss-up which is better, but the loss of an extra enchantment slot makes one-handed weapons unequivocally better in my opinion, especially for a non-plate armor class. I have a funny anecdote about equipment. When I got out of the first dungeon and was getting my bearings in the game, being told to die by tavern patrons, I sold everything I looted from the first dungeon, including a lucky enchanted plate helmet worth 10k gold. With this gold, I fully outfitted myself with chain armor and continued the quest. I found out I needed to go to Hammerfell, so I traveled to the nearest city there, Alinhir. At this point, I was researching equipment more and found out what I mentioned earlier, that store stocks are consistent across games. I found out katanas were the best one-handed weapon, so I looked for an enchanted ebony katana I could buy. Wouldn't you know it, an enchanted ebony katana that fortifies agility, arguably the most important stat, was right there with me in Alinhir. Unfortunately, the katana costs about 13.5k and I was about 4k too short. But then I found out from a tavern keeper that there was an upcoming holiday that would slash all prices by half. So you can bet I slept for 16 days, woke up, went over to the store and slammed 6.5k, after negotiation, down on the table, getting myself probably the best weapon I could get in the whole game before doing the second story dungeon. Only a couple dungeons after that, I saved up enough to travel to Somerset Isle to get an enchanted ebony kite shield, which I also mained for the rest of the game. At this point, only accessories were really worth anything to me in terms of equipment progression, given that chain armor maxes out immediately and my sword and shield were already top tier. Finally, let's talk about artifact quests. You can't really say you've experienced Arena unless you've done at least one of these. Unlike other quests, you get a hook for these by asking for general rumors from NPCs. The chance to get one goes up with level, but you can actually talk to the same NPC repeatedly and you'll get it eventually, as long as they say anything interesting at all. Major note: you cannot get an artifact quest if you already have an artifact in your inventory. Don't be stupid like me and waste probably an hour talking to NPCs and trying to figure out why it's not working, getting confused because 2 artifacts, the Ring of Finaster and the Skeleton Key, are actually mentioned in idle rumors that don't give you the quest. The UESP does not mention this very important fact as far as I can tell. I only found out because of a random comment on Reddit. Anyway, once you get the rumor, you'll be directed to a tavern. Like other tavern quests, you'll talk to the innkeeper, and then someone will approach you with pretty cool unique dialogue that's different depending on the artifact you're after. You actually have to negotiate a price for the information from the guy, which is pretty neat. He will then generate a dungeon in a province, telling you that the dungeon contains a map to the real dungeon with the artifact. Another note, although this one is prominent on the UESP, the first dungeon will always be in the same province for a particular artifact, and you cannot get the quest in this province. So if the first dungeon is in Skyrim, you have to get the quest outside of Skyrim. After getting the location, you'll go to a dungeon which is pretty much like the standard generated ones, but 4 floors instead of 2, and no boss monsters. At the bottom of the 4th floor, you'll find a hard-to-click map on the ground, which will generate another dungeon in a different province. This next dungeon will also have 4 floors, and at the bottom of it you'll find a chest, clicking on which will grant you the artifact with no need to unlock it. The artifacts include some familiar names like Ariel Shield and Bow, the Ebony Mail and Blade, Volendrung, Spellmaker, the Skeleton Key, the Ogma Infinium, and more. There's also the Necromancer's Amulet, an important item in Oblivion, and its quest dialogue actually mentions Mana Marco. Also, the dialogue all refers to it as the Necromancer's robes for some reason. One major problem with the weapon and armor artifacts, they all have really good enchantments, but unless the UESP is misleading me, they all have the stats of the base form of whatever they are. This means that the Ebony Blade, a katana, does not have as good of stats as a basic ebony katana. Because of this, I was never interested in using any of them. The rings are pretty good, as is the Necromancer's Amulet, which grants -9 AC to every body part, and I of course wore until the end of the game after getting it. There's also King Orgnum's Coffer, which gives you a paltry amount of gold daily, the Skeleton Key, which is cool, but unlocking doors one way or another shouldn't be hard by the time you're doing artifact quests, and then the extremely broken Ogma Infinium. It's hard to overstate how busted this item is. It gives you 50 attribute points. You normally get 4 to 6 attribute points per level, so you're basically getting 10 free levels of attribute points, in a game where your max level will usually be around 20. To put it another way, if you get this book once, your bonus attribute points by the end of the game will be about 50% higher than if you hadn't, and you can get it multiple times. I decided to go for it only once, after I struggled hard in Fortress of Ice, and it made the rest of my experience with the game go much smoother afterward. I won't bother describing what leads to every story dungeon because they're all basically the same. After you complete a dungeon, you'll get a dream from Rhea telling you the name of the next dungeon. You ask about that name in rumors until you get directed to the correct province, so you go there and ask about it until you get directed to the correct settlement, and finally the correct person in that settlement, usually either the ruler or the Mages Guild. This person will then tell you that they need an artifact to translate an Elder Scroll, and the Elder Scroll will tell you the location of the dungeon, so you need to go to an intermediate dungeon to get the thing they want. Once you get it, they'll tell you where the real dungeon is, you go there to get the staff piece, and the cycle will continue. Each of the staff piece dungeons has a unique map icon, as well as art, and an introduction the first time you go to it, which is pretty nice. I tended to avoid looking up the dungeon maps online unless I really got lost or just felt like being done with the floor I was on. In a lot of the dungeons, you can skip like 80% of them if you just beeline for the goal. The Imperial Dungeons. This is honestly a really good introductory dungeon. It starts you in a locked cell with a key to get you out, and it's actually on a raised surface so you can click it easily. This teaches you about locked doors and picking things up, lessons that sound obvious but are important to establish early on through gameplay. It usually has a message near enemy spawn so you're not completely caught off guard while you're trying to learn the controls too. The rats and goblins you'll encounter here should be no problem for you as long as you make sure to rest, allowing you to get used to both combat and the resting mechanic. It also has messages informing you how the raised surfaces are relatively safer rest areas. Rhea will tell you to go southwest to escape, but you can ignore her and run all around, and you'll be rewarded with gold and equipment. The layout is pretty simple, but includes water paths so you can get used to navigating those. Unless you run straight to the exit, you should level up in this dungeon, and upon resting, Rhea will visit you in your dreams to tell you the name of the next dungeon so you can ask about it when you escape to the surface. After leaving through the shift gate, you'll spawn in a random settlement in your race's home province. Also, check out the sick jump slash I did on this goblin. Stone Keep. Once you ask around about Fang Lair after escaping the first dungeon, you'll eventually be directed to Hammerfell. Rhea will also tell you Fang Lair was built by dwarves, which is just neat that's the first mention of them in the series. Anyway, you'll be told to go to Stone Keep when talking to the relevant person. This is a pretty basic one-floor dungeon. It actually has a second floor, but it's unimplemented. Nothing here really gave me trouble except the spiders, especially because, fun fact, if they paralyze you in water, you die instantly by drowning. The Minotaurs and ghouls were kinda tough, but as long as I was healed up before fighting them, I could beat them consistently and then just have to rest after. Fang Lair. The main gimmick of this dungeon is navigating the tunnels that go under the ground in between rooms. It also introduces ghosts who don't do a lot of damage but can drain your magicka really quickly. Near the end, you come into a room that asks you a minor logic puzzle, and if you get it wrong, it releases a bunch of spiders on you. The second floor is pretty cool. It's small, but it's a sick looking area with a bunch of lava around. As expected, lava acts like water, but it hurts you, unless you have fire resist. Once you get the first piece of the staff, Jagar Tharn will appear the next time you rest to taunt you and summon an enemy to fight you, and from now on you'll see him when you die instead of Rhea. Fortress of Ice. The next pair of dungeons is located in Skyrim. This place was hell and almost broke me. The Snow Wolves rapid fire spells and can down you pretty quickly if you don't kill them ASAP. I also had a lot of trouble with the human enemies in here. I kept finding groups of like 3 to 4 knights who would kick my ass if I didn't stay on top of healing spells. Finally, there were ice golems, who are slow but do fast, big damage and take like 5 fire darts each to take down. I had to rest after pretty much every encounter in this dungeon. Labyrinthian. Like I mentioned before, I majorly powered up between this dungeon and the last one with the Augmund, Vinium, Necromancer's Amulet, and the Ancient Power of Redditor Advice. I was told that shield spells are a bit OP in this game, so I started running around with those active most of the time. I also bought a ton of other useful spells. Hellhounds had the same problem of nearly instantly downing me that the Ice Wolves had, but with the Resist Fire spell they weren't so bad. I also started using light spells in this dungeon, which helped a lot, though you have to recast it every time you rest. Anyway, this place lives up to its name. I wouldn't say navigating it is particularly difficult, it just takes a long time. It has a smaller upper floor and then the truly labyrinthine lower floor, which is split into 2 halves. You have to find a key in the first half, which is in a spot in the northeast corner that is kind of hard to get to, mainly because of the janky climbing controls. You then move to the other half of the labyrinth, and this one's key was actually way easier to get to. After getting both keys, you return to the first floor and use them to get past 2 doors, answer another riddle to open the last door, then fight a boss to get the next staff piece. Selene's Web. I actually figured out this next one was in Valenwood from Rhea's speech without asking around. Looking back, I probably could have guessed the same about Skyrim if I noticed that Rhea called out the Fortress of Ice. This intermediate dungeon actually breaks the pattern and has a somewhat interesting reason for doing it, which is that Selene is apparently threatening Valenwood, and as Valenwood has no standing army, you need to help them by stealing her jewel, which gives her power. I guess with Tharn running the Empire, he doesn't care enough to send Imperial troops to help them. I found the downward stairs on my map pretty quickly. The door to these stairs was locked, but I could just passwall past them, which I tried doing in the last dungeon and it didn't let me, so of course now I have to try it every time I find a locked door. The second floor of this dungeon kinda sucks. It's a bunch of long and winding pathways that are dead ends and don't connect to each other, so then you just have to run backwards through them for a while. Passwall would be very useful here to escape the pathways early, but at this point that spell still costed like half my magicka meter, so I didn't want to use it willy-nilly like that. Eventually I found another locked door, and passwall didn't work on this one. Wander around and you'll find a training area full of door-opening spiders. These spiders can still be pretty dangerous if they gang up on and paralyze you. Make it through there and you'll get to a crypt full of ghosts and barbarians. Vault over a wall to grab the key, and then use that key to grab the heart of Selene. Elden Grove. The upper floor of this dungeon is pretty neat. It's ostensibly outdoors, a hedge maze with wide open areas, plenty of trees, and a white fog that light doesn't dispel. Enemies here are wolves who are very easy at this point, and white ghosts that blend in with the fog a little too well. The lower level is a crypt full of zombies, ghosts, and rats? Haven't seen them for a bit, and they're literal nothing enemies now, but whatever. You can find your way over to a large underground water area where the water stretches over most of the entire northwest corner of the map. There's even a boat you can use, though I lost it pretty quickly. You'll eventually find a large island you have to climb on without getting killed, then you can answer a riddle to fight some more ghosts and get the next piece of the staff. You also have to answer a riddle to leave this dungeon. Here's a complete aside of some stuff that happened to me after I finished Elden Grove. I went to the nearest town and found myself in a maze with water surrounding me, and even more disorienting was the presence of wandering NPCs despite it being dark. The time said 8 in the morning and the map showed water all around the edges of the city. I eventually found my way to the city proper and slept until the next morning when the light bug fixed itself. I went to the local palace to look for a quest and decided to check if the side rooms had anything interesting, which I'd done many times to no avail. I broke into this torture chamber, and it had a corpse in it with 10k gold on it. Not an amount to sneeze at, and this was the only time I ever found anything like this in the palace. I went to the dungeon the king sent me to for a side quest and was visited by Jagar Tharn, who sent a big evil robot at me, an iron golem. Apparently this thing is resistant to spells, so it was just a war of attrition as I swung my sword, healed myself, and buffed my strength to try to survive its onslaught. Later, I talked to a wizard and asked who he was, and he surprisingly referred to the random town I spawned into after escaping the Imperial dungeons, implying I'm actually from that town, which is pretty neat. Temple of Agamanus. Ria's dialogue tells you that the next dungeon pair is neither Elsewhere or Black Marsh, and asking NPCs will point you to Elsewhere. This is the first dungeon with 3 floors, and every one of those floors is packed to the gills with hellhounds, so you better have some way of resisting fire. First floor is pretty fun to explore, it has a lot of locked doors leading to big, interesting rooms. The next 2 floors were pretty standard fare, though the 3rd floor had some annoyingly long water passageways. Answer a riddle and you're on your way. Halls of Colossus. You come in here and find a note on the corpse that tells you need 6 keys, but if I find whatever door needs that many keys, you bet I'm gonna try pass-falling it. It tells you to go north for the first key, which you find pretty easily. I found this door that said the lock should give me no trouble, and I couldn't open it after like 20 attempts. Then I found a chest that said it'd be a miracle if I picked it, so of course I opened it first try, and it had 3 gold in it. This dungeon is huge and sprawling, and I think to apologize for that, the devs made the enemies in it pretty easy. I found my way to the 2nd floor, which is this big hall full of pillars that connects a bunch of stairs back up to the 1st floor. I found the first door in the series of 6, and was shocked it actually let me pass fall around it. I feel kind of bad skipping so much of the dungeon, but with the enemies I was seeing, it's not like I'm missing out on much XP. Anyway, upon going down to the 3rd floor, you have to answer a question. The answer is found in the dungeon if you want to look for it. I looked it up though because I thought it was just another riddle I couldn't parse. You then get to a math question that should be easy, except you need to somehow know that you should sum the numerical letters of these 2 sphinxes' names to find out their ages, and I see no indication that you should do that. Once you open this door, you go into this gigantic hall filled with huge columns, floating platforms, and a bunch of homunculi around. These guys use lightning spells, so like all spellcasters, they can be dealt with fairly easily with resist shock. Get that staff piece and go on your way. Temple of the Mad God. This time, Tharn just sends a couple of orcs after you, extremely lame after he sent a Terminator last time. I misinterpreted what Rio was saying and thought the next dungeon would be in High Rock, but if you're actually intelligent, you can realize that it's in Somerset Isle without asking around. You get sent to the Temple of the Mad God, who was probably called that just because it sounded cool, but was later named as Sheogorath. Unfortunately, this dungeon doesn't feel very mad. It's alright, and on the lower floor I ran into some monks and iron golems who were decently hard, but my shield spell kept them at bay. The lower floor feels like a big prison, and I found a loot room with a note that pointed me to the northeast corner of the map. I answered probably the easiest riddle yet to get the crystal and get out of there. Crystal Tower. This dungeon is 4 floors tall, earning its tower status somewhat, though I think it'd be kinda cool if it was like 10 very small floors. Each floor is visually very distinct though, which is cool. It was here that I realized that I think whether or not you can lockpick a door in the dungeon is pre-rolled when you enter the floor, so trying multiple times is worthless, and if it doesn't work at first, you should just bash it open. The 3rd floor of this tower is the most interesting area so far. It's basically a zoo of different enemies with some notes, like that zombies cause disease and ice golems have a damage aura, which I didn't know. Near the end here there's a cell with your name on it, raw as fuck. The very last cell is a fire demon, a tough enemy who doesn't appear to take extra damage from ice like I thought he would. Despite his name and his sword being on fire in his sprite, I also don't think his melee attacks do fire damage because my resist fire spell didn't seem to help. I unlocked his cell with a key I picked up somewhere and killed him for a level up. There are some other new enemies that can be found here, a stone golem and a couple Medusa. Stone golems cast powerful magic attacks and Medusas cast stun spells, but if you get up close they're forced to use melee attacks and they're not too bad. Also, the Medusa corpse sprite feels particularly gruesome. Mines of Curus. The only hint Ria tells you for the next dungeon is that it has to be in one of the 3 provinces we haven't got a staff piece from yet. High Rock was the nearest of the 3, so I went there, and that happened to be right. Funnily, I went there to find the Heart's Crypt, and I happened to arrive in town on Heart's Day, meaning I got a free stay at an inn. This time we're directed to a temple, which mildly shakes up the formula. The quest is still to find something to decipher an Elder Scroll to tell us where the real dungeon is, but this one is actually kind of interesting. A priest apparently went crazy after realizing the Emperor was an imposter and that he must be saved by the Staff of Chaos, so he murdered another priest and then ran into these mines to die with the thing we need while searching for it. This is a fiery, lava-y dungeon. A hint tells you to go southwest, and I searched pretty much the entire southwest quadrant of the map before I looked it up to find that the hint is bullshit and the way down is pretty much in the center of the map. I mean, it's maybe a little bit south and a tiny bit west, but what a bad hint. It's not even southwest relative to the entrance, it's nearly straight south. Wander around the second floor and you'll eventually find the priest's corpse with the map next to it. Crypt of Hearts. This is another 4-floor dungeon, and the first floor is sprawling. As you run around, you'll find several of these cool shrines with corpses around them. I also found my first vampire in a mausoleum, which seemed like an appropriate opportunity to utilize my Mark of Force Bolt, which is probably the strongest pre-packaged spell in the game. It's kind of funny that I've been fighting hellhounds for so long, but they can still down me within a few seconds if I don't notice them and activate Fire Resist. Continuing through the dungeon, you'll fight more of the same enemies. I fought another vampire who somehow died with a skeleton standing up, and found this room with a giant hole in the middle with platforms floating over it for some reason. On the final floor, I learned that despite looking like it, stone golems' magic attacks are not shock, so to resist them you need to use the more expensive spells to resist or reflect magic in general. Eventually you'll find a crypt in a large room surrounded by pits and fight 2 fire demons for the next staff piece. Vaults of Gimin. Once again, Rhea just tells you to check one of the last 2 provinces, but given the name Mirkwood, you can make a pretty easy guess that it'll be in Blackmarsh. The first floor is made up of a lot of little rooms. According to the UESP, it's over 80. The enemies here throw a variety of fire, shock, and pure magic spells, so I ran around with reflect magic on. Eventually, I got tired of wandering the nothingness and looked up how to get to the next floor. The second floor is made up of a bunch of islands connected by bridges. I ran into a bug, which is noted on the UESP when trying to return the tablet. The priest wouldn't recognize that I had it and just acted like a normal priest. A good old-fashioned drop to DOS reboot fixed it. Mirkwood. This is another outdoor dungeon like Elden Grove, and it's ginormous, feeling about the same size as a settlement. Sometimes you'll run for a while and not even see any walls. After I ran along the edges for a bit, I figured I probably needed to go to the center, and that was correct. Near the center, the hedge walls become denser and then turn into stone, leading into a little crypt. There isn't really anything in the crypt besides some iron golems to punish you if you get the riddle wrong, and of course the staff piece. You should be out of this dungeon soon enough, which feels like the calm before the storm of the final few dungeons. One thing this dungeon did do was make me realize that the default paralysis heal spell was just not cutting it with the Medusas, so I made my own more effective one instead. Black Gate. It should be obvious where the last staff piece is, given that's the only province left. In case that wasn't enough, Rhea mentions a volcano, which can only really be one place. And in case that wasn't enough, Tharn will straight up tell you it's in Morrowind. It feels poetic for my character to be returning to Morrowind after starting his journey there. We're also retrieving a unique sprite this time, a big hammer to be used with an ancient dwarven forge. The first floor of this dungeon feels sort of like a city, with different districts separated by a river. There's a bunch of medium-sized rooms, which mostly will have 2 to 4 of the same type of enemy in them. I tested out a strongly scaling damage spell I made here called Deleter on some Medusa, because they kept taking turns paralyzing me to death, and it worked pretty well. The second floor has an area with 3 key doors into it that can't be passwalled through. You can get any of the 3 keys to access the hammer, although according to the UESP, one of them is an enemy drop that doesn't spawn sometimes. I finally found one of them after a very long time of wandering. Dagoth. There are several dungeons in this game which appeared in later games. Halls of Colossus, Fang Lair, Mines of Curus, Crypt of Hearts, Crystal Tower, Selene's Web, and Labyrinthian all appear in ESO, with Labyrinthian also appearing in Skyrim, although both of these iterations are not very labyrinthine. Arguably, the opening prison escape into the sewers inspired the intro to Oblivion. But by far the most notable of these is Dagoth, which serves as the final dungeon in Morrowind, with the final boss sharing the name as well. Anyway, the first floor of this dungeon has some interesting areas, but it isn't too much to write home about, although I didn't explore all of it. There was another vampire in a crypt here, which I tried my Deleter spell on for a satisfying one-hit kill. The second floor is really cool. Thin hallways connect 5 different rooms which each hold a key, and you need all 5 keys to progress. They actually remembered to put the keys on raised surfaces so you can pick them up. I ended up finding 3 of the keys before finding the locked doors, even though they're right across from the entrance. The hardest to get to key is guarded by our first Lich, a super powerful enemy that took 3 of my deleter spells to take down. After this fight, I realized I was out of Magicka Restore potions, which was very bad as I really relied on Magicka at this point in the game to survive fights, and running out of Magicka mid-fight is a huge problem, especially with those Magicka draining ghosts floating around. Not wanting to go back though, I continued on to the 3rd floor anyway. The 3rd floor is a giant fire lake with platforms scattered around holding homunculine fire demons. There's also a Lich at the north end of the room, who I would have fought if I had more potions. Levitate around fighting things until you get to the center where you have to jump into a hole to get the final staff piece, this one being the top of the staff and actually having a different sprite. The Imperial Palace. Tharn will visit you in your dreams to tell you that although you have the staff, he drained it of its magic, but he invites you to come fight him at the Imperial Palace. I thought Rhea would appear to tell me that I can restore the staff by killing him or something, but she's gone oddly silent. So, all that's left to do is go to the Imperial Palace and hope the magic being drained solves itself along the way. Head to the Imperial City and go to the palace gates, where you'll see a sprite of the palace awkwardly floating above a hole in the city walls. Enter, and Tharn will threaten you with millennia of torture and taunt you to come get him. You can't leave after entering here, so make sure to come prepared and drop a save outside just in case. This is another 4th-floor dungeon, but it doesn't take as long as you might think. You just have to be able to carve your way through swaths of enemies. I'm pretty sure the 1st floor here is actually just one of the standard palace layouts but with stairs added, which is pretty cool. I immediately noticed it was using the same textures, but opening your map also reveals the entire thing to you, like non-dungeon maps usually do. There's some monsters sprinkled around here, but you'll mostly be slaughtering Imperial guards. Maybe they're evil too? Let's not think about it. They take a while to bring down though, so it's kind of hard not to think about it. The 2nd floor has a metric ton of iron golems, who funnily are way easier now than the scaled knights are. There's also a lot of Medusas and vampires hanging around. It's fun to look in all the little side rooms and find tables filled with various objects, making this feel more like a real palace and not just a generic dungeon. Unlike other dungeons though, enemies here seem to spawn pretty much endlessly, which unfortunately makes resting nigh impossible and kind of discourages exploration in general. Hope you brought plenty of potions because you won't be getting any sleep. Also, my game kept crashing while casting fireballs at large groups of enemies, which sucked. The 3rd floor is more of the same as the 2nd floor, except the walls are more rocky, driving home how we're going deeper into the earth. One part of this floor has a bunch of prison cells, while another is a library. The final floor is more rocky tunnels and cells, both endlessly spawning liches. It's not worth trying to fight them because they'll just keep coming. Sprint through until you come to a lava lake with an island in the middle where Jagar Tharn waits for you. A couple casts of my deleter and he cocooned himself, giving me the opportunity to loot a key from him. Funnily, the game just calls him a battle mage when you look at him. Open a door with a key and interact with something, which is capable of restoring the staff's magic somehow. My game actually crashed here, so I had to redo the fight with the stability mod on, which meant no sound. A pretty metal animation of Tharn melting plays, and Uriel Septim comes out to thank you for saving him. The game tells you to keep adventuring, and you pop back out in the Imperial City. I tried asking around and no one was talking about the Emperor, so I guess the news hadn't broken yet. Trying to go to the palace will have the game tell you the way is blocked as they make repairs after your epic battle. So that's Arena. What did I think of it? Well, I enjoyed it a decent amount, despite having many frustrations with it. The dungeon design was pretty cool, and I actually really enjoyed the combat spellcasting for the most part. Never in an Elder Scrolls game have I used such a wide variety of spells on a regular basis. Like a lot of RPGs, the curve of levels gained to time was logarithmic, but it felt pretty extreme here. I entered the 5th dungeon at level 12, and finished the 18th and final dungeon at level 20. You level up so quickly at first, but after that 5th dungeon or so, the levels start only coming once every dungeon or two. The story and lore are obviously very lacking, but you can't expect much better when the game's premise was changed so recently before release that they couldn't update the title. You just kind of have to accept that the story is bare bones and enjoy the vibes and dungeon crawling. While they're not very distinguished from each other and it's mostly proc-gen, it is pretty cool that you can visit so many sprawling cities in every province of Tamriel, except for Cyrodiil. Having to wander around countless buildings and ask for directions can actually feel oddly immersive. I think there are 3 major humps in this game, and if you can get past them, you can definitely beat it. To be clear, I think anyone could beat this game with enough dedication, but it's a matter of keeping that dedication alive. The first hump is simply getting out of the first dungeon. This will require you to understand the basics of the controls, combat, and resting. The second hump is beating the second dungeon, Stone Keep. Might sound obvious, but it's less about the dungeon itself and more that getting to it will require you to learn how to navigate the cities and ask NPCs for directions. You'll also have to learn how to use shop services to sell your loot from the first dungeon, buy some better equipment, and rest at taverns as you travel around. This hump is where I bounced off the game so many years ago. I was able to beat the first dungeon, but I was having trouble with the controls, and I think the game's faux scope intimidated me away from it. Seeing the huge map with all the different settlements was intimidating, I think, because I hadn't quite internalized that you're really only intended to interact with maybe 0.01% of the overworld. The last hump is beating the fourth dungeon, Fortress of Ice. I had a lot of trouble with this one, and from what I've seen online, it's a pretty common pain point for people. If you can master the game system well enough to get through here, you can absolutely press through to the end. In case you're curious, my final playtime on Steam was 30.3 hours. But a decent bit of that would have been me just leaving the game open while I go to write notes in the script, or doing things for research or to get footage of them, so my true playtime was probably more like 25 hours or so. I've never made a video like this before, and I'm not sure if I'll make another one, but I had a lot of fun doing it. If I do another, then the logical next step would be the next game in the Elder Scrolls, Daggerfall. But I don't know, with the Unity release, that game has gotten a lot of coverage recently already. Also, I'm intimidated by the scale of it with its many joinable factions and side quests. No, if I do any more videos, I think I'm gonna go a little more obscure. If you made it all the way through here, thanks for watching.